Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the merciless trials faced by peasants who endured the long, bitter winters of the Middle Ages, when frost crept beneath doors, food vanished with the wind, and survival became a daily act of will. Close your eyes, if you will, and let your mind drift back with me. Back to a time when the world was simpler, yet far more perilous. When a man's word was his bond, and steel sang its deadly song under the morning sun. But before we begin, tell me, fellow wanderer, from what distant land do you listen? And what time does your clock strike as my account reaches you? It brings me comfort to know when and where my voice is heard. I remember winters that came like silent executioners, veiled in white and stillness, yet heavy with menace. There was no gentleness in their arrival, only sudden cold that bit through every layer and whispered through the cracks of our frail shelters. The wind howled not in anger, but in cruel indifference. It knew no master and offered no mercy. You did not walk into winter. You braced for its assault and hoped your body remembered warmth well enough to last. The huts we built were no match for what came. Wood warped, thatch thinned, and frost settled on the inside of our walls like a second skin. At night, I could feel the cold enter my bones, curling into my joints and stealing sleep. We lay there, wrapped in all we owned, too stiff to shiver. The dark was deep, but the cold was deeper still. It pressed into your chest until you dreamed of fire and awoke in pain. There was no choice but to endure. A man could not plead with the season, nor could he escape it. Snow blocked paths, and ice broke carts. Even strong horses faltered under the burden of frost. We relied on habit more than hope. Each day became a ritual of preservation: feed the fire, patch the roof, silence the hunger. There was no romance in it, only repetition and resolve. Some mornings I stepped outside and heard nothing. Not a crow, not a bell, not even the breath of the earth. That silence was the cruelest part. It meant life had hidden or perished. It meant no visitors, no trade, no word from neighbouring villages. Just the sound of my boots crunching on snow and the question hanging in the air: who didn't make it through the night? Children cried in the early weeks but grew quieter with time, conserving energy for the effort of living. Their faces grew pale, their limbs thin beneath worn wool. I carried one small boy once, frozen still in his sleep, and laid him on straw with more care than I'd ever given to gold. His mother did not cry. She had no tears left to give. Grief in winter was not loud. It was silent, like the snow. We kept fires going with anything that burned. Not just wood, but dung, old furniture, even rotted fence posts if need be. The scent was acrid, clinging to our hair and clothes, but we welcomed it. Smoke meant heat, and heat meant life. I came to love that smell, strange as it sounds. It was proof of resistance, of defiance against a season that wanted us buried. Some said winter was a punishment from God, a trial of faith and flesh. Others simply cursed it in bitter whispers as they rubbed their hands and watched frost reclaim the fields. I never spoke of it aloud. I only listened to the wind, to the creaking of beams above me, to the shallow breathing of those beside me. Winter teaches you that survival has a sound, and that silence is its absence. If you've only known winter from behind glass windows and woolen coats, then you've never met it face to face. You've never felt it peel your resolve from your skin or heard it test the heartbeat of your kin. That was our winter, not a season, but a siege, and every year we prayed it would not be our last. The place I called home during those winters was no fortress against the cold. It was a wattle and daub hut, humble and hastily patched, where the walls wept moisture and the roof whispered secrets to the sky. The wind knew the way in well enough, slithering through the gaps with ease. We layered straw along the walls and stuffed old rags beneath the door, but the chill was tireless. It seeped in, no matter the hour or effort. Our only heat came from the hearth, which was both a blessing and a curse. A single fire had to warm the air, cook our food, and dry the damp clothes clinging to our backs. But more often than not, the smoke hung heavy in the room, stinging our eyes and blackening our throats. Chimneys were rare luxuries. We relied on a hole in the roof, but when snow covered it or wind changed direction, the smoke curled back down and filled the room like a spirit refusing to leave. I can still see the soot that gathered on every beam, and the way the walls darkened with each passing week. The warmth barely reached the corners of the hut. We slept close, not from affection, but from necessity. I remember the nights when we lay like firewood ourselves, stacked for survival. If someone shifted in the dark, the draft would find us, and we'd wake shivering and cursing, yet grateful to still draw breath. Moisture was our constant companion. The earth floor grew slick with it, and straw rotted beneath our feet. The walls oozed with condensation. Nothing ever felt truly dry, not the blankets, not the bread, not the air. The damp bred illness like a crop, and once it took root, it lingered. Coughs echoed through the night, soft at first, then deeper, more persistent, as if the house itself were trying to breathe through the weight of winter. There were days when the frost formed inside, clinging to the iron nails and wooden tools. I traced it once, a fragile lace along the window's edge, and thought it beautiful in its cruelty. That was the paradox of those homes. They sheltered you from the storm, yes, but they also became your prison of cold. You could not flee it, only huddle within it, shrinking yourself into smaller shapes to conserve warmth. We kept animals in the same space, not out of convenience, but for heat. A goat's breath, a hen's body. They gave off warmth that mattered, but with them came fleas, dung, and noise. Still, I welcomed their presence. Better the stink of life than the silence of absence. Some nights, I would rest with my back against the cow, feeling her ribs rise and fall, pretending they were my own heartbeat, steady and strong. Tools we hung near the fire cracked from heat and cold. Leather stiffened into boards. Clay pots broke when the fire burned unevenly. Everything was at risk, not just us. I remember running my fingers over a wooden cup, softened and blackened by years of smoke, and thinking, this is what time does to all things here. It doesn't just age them, it breaks them slowly. When people speak now of rustic charm, of cottages and simple living, I wonder if they've ever felt a floor freeze beneath their feet, if they've ever woken to see their breath suspended above them like a final prayer. Our homes were not places of comfort in winter. They were battlegrounds, and every night survived was a small and silent victory. When winter came, we wrapped ourselves not in comfort, but in whatever remained intact from the seasons before. There were no lined cloaks or fur-lined boots, only coarse wool, thick, scratchy, and often damp. We layered what we had, tunics over undershirts, cloaks over tunics, all stiff from wear and stained by life. Clothing was not changed daily. It was kept on until the body or the season forced it off, and often that was too late. Wool was our main defense, but poorly spun and often reused from worn-out garments. Holes were mended with different colors and textures, giving us a patchwork appearance, like scarecrows in motion. I once had a cloak so full of stitches it weighed more than the shirt beneath it. But warmth did not come from layers alone. It came from movement, from proximity, from luck. A still man froze faster than a moving one, and sleep was the most dangerous stillness of all. We did not know the comfort of dry socks or undergarments. Feet stayed damp for days, and shoes were made from hard leather that split in the cold. If a sole broke, there was no replacement. I recall stuffing straw inside mine to keep the snow from biting through, but straw rots, and soon, so did the skin beneath it. Blisters opened, froze, and became wounds that refused to heal in the dark of winter. Lice made their homes in the folds of our clothing, invisible but ever present. We scratched until skin broke, until blood stained our cuffs. Some tied herbs around their wrists or necks, hoping the smell would repel the creatures. But it never lasted. The cold didn't kill them. It slowed them, perhaps, but only enough to let them hide deeper in the seams. And when the thaw came, they returned in full force, like winter's cruel parting gift. There were no buttons or zippers, only ties and brooches, often broken or lost. I remember holding a cloak closed with twine for weeks, fingers stiff each morning as I tried to fasten it again. The wind crept in through every opening. It found your wrists, your neck, the place where your shirt had torn and not been mended. We became experts at feeling air, sensing it like a second skin that was always colder than our own. Children wore what they were handed, regardless of fit. I saw sleeves drag through fire ash, hems freeze stiff with urine and mud. A child's coat was often an adult's old shirt, belted tight with rope. We laughed sometimes at how foolish we looked, but it was laughter without joy, a survival reflex, a way to hold back the tears that would only freeze on our cheeks. Those who had fur, true fur, from animals they'd trapped or inherited, were rare and envied. Even then, the furs were often stiff and dirty, full of fleas or matted with grease. But to have a lining of fox or badger around your collar was to walk in privilege. I only wore fur once, borrowed for a funeral, and I wept more for the warmth it gave me than for the man being buried. To dress for winter in the peasant world was not to prepare, it was to surrender. You accepted the cold and built a fragile armor from rags and memory. You hoped your body would remember last year's cold and hold on just long enough. And always, beneath the layers, was skin, tender, human, and painfully aware of the season's contempt. By the time December arrived, the bounty of harvest had faded into memory. What little had been gathered was tucked away in sacks or jars, hidden from rats and neighbors alike. But the truth was simple, it was never enough. The turnips shriveled, the cabbage rotted at the core, and the grain always seemed to vanish faster than it should. We rationed with trembling hands, knowing full well the cold months ahead would not respect our calculations. There was no daily market to run to, no delivery of fresh bread. What we had, and what we didn't, we did without. Dried peas and beans became the mainstay, boiled again and again into gruel that neither satisfied nor nourished. Old bread, so hard it needed soaking to chew, was considered treasure. We gnawed on the past, hoping it would carry us towards spring. Hunger wasn't a visitor. It was a resident in every hut. Meat was a dream. Most of us had no animals to spare. Chickens were for eggs, not slaughter. A pig might be killed once a year if fortune smiled, but never in the deep of winter, not unless death loomed larger than need. I remember chewing on bones from a dog that had died naturally. There was shame in it, but greater shame in letting a child starve beside you. The forest, once a source of hope, offered little when the snow fell. Traps caught only emptiness. The deer vanished, the birds fled, and even the rabbits seemed to disappear beneath the earth. I once found a frozen squirrel and thanked God aloud. I roasted it slowly over the fire, and though its meat was scant and bitter, I savoured every bite as though it were boar at a lord's feast. Our elders warned us not to eat certain berries or roots in desperation. But desperation cares little for warnings. I saw a woman boil dock leaves until they turned black, then serve them to her family with a smile too wide, too brittle. They all vomited later, pale as the snow outside. Hunger clouded judgment, turned men into liars, thieves, and worse. But there was no one to judge. We were all the same beneath the hollow eyes. Even salt was rare. Preserving food required it, but it came at a cost many couldn't afford. Without it, even the meat that could be saved was lost to rot. I remember scraping mould from dried sausages, praying the centre was still good. We prayed not for abundance, just for enough. Enough to keep the children quiet. Enough to keep from dreaming of food we'd never taste again. The cold made everything harder, but hunger made it cruel. You could escape the wind for a moment, press against another body and share warmth. But hunger hollowed you from within. It made you short-tempered, silent, slow. It frayed your memory and stole your sleep. And worst of all, it became normal. Something you wore beneath your clothes, like a second, gnawing skin. Food was not a meal in those winters. It was a question, a hope, a fight. We counted grains as if they were coins. We stared into empty bowls, willing them to fill. And when they didn't, we lowered our heads, tightened our belts, and whispered to ourselves, just one more day. Let me make it one more day. As the weeks dragged on and the cold deepened, hunger transformed from a discomfort into a quiet torment that shaped every thought and movement. It dulled the senses and made time feel slower. I recall waking in the night, not from cold, but from the pain of an empty stomach twisting on itself. The body, having nothing left to burn, began to consume its own strength. Faces grew hollow, cheeks sank, the light in people's eyes dimmed, not from death, but from the long walk toward it. Starvation did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in silently, like frost under the door. First came weakness, a child too tired to play, an elder too slow to stand. Then came confusion. People forgot their tasks, mixed words, stared at walls. I watched a woman boil leather shoes, hoping to extract some nourishment from the boiled hides. The smell was sharp, acidic, and strange, but we ate it without hesitation. That's what winter does. It teaches you to forget disgust. Neighbors grew suspicious. Whispers traveled faster than smoke. Who still had food? Who was hiding something? There were eyes at every crack in the door, watching what you carried, what you burned, what you cooked. And if you did eat, you did so in silence, lest someone hear the sound of chewing and come knocking with desperate eyes and shaking hands. Charity, when offered, could save or doom a household. It was a holy act, but a dangerous one. I once saw a man break apart an old drum, soften the rawhide in water, and feed it to his children. They gnawed on it like meat, believing in the illusion it gave. The mind, when starving, will accept any comfort, even a lie. And in those days, a lie could keep you alive. Not physically, perhaps, but spiritually, just enough to make it to morning. I sometimes think that imagination was our final refuge. The children suffered most. I still see the small boy who used to laugh even when his stomach was empty. One day, he simply stopped laughing. He sat near the fire with his mouth open, as if waiting for something. A miracle, maybe. But none came. He passed one night without a sound, wrapped in his mother's arms. She held him until he was cold, and then kept holding him, as though her warmth might call him back. Even the strongest grew weak, muscles wasted, eyes dulled, tempers flared. I saw good men strike their wives in fits of despair, not from anger, but from hopelessness. Hunger stripped us bare, of dignity, of manners, of restraint. It exposed what lay beneath: fear, desperation, and the instinct to survive. We prayed harder in those months, not for feasts, but for crumbs. Not for comfort, but for endurance. Some turned to the woods, to hunt in forbidden lands. The penalty for poaching was harsh, a missing hand, sometimes a hanging. But when the belly growls louder than fear, the law becomes just another danger to navigate. I went once, with a friend. We found nothing. He fell through ice on the way home. I still hear the way he gasped before the silence swallowed him. I brought back only wet boots and guilt. And yet amid all this we carried on. We walked, we worked. We buried our dead and tried again. Starvation was not a plague that struck and passed. It was a tradition, cruel and ancient, passed from one winter to the next. And every year, We wondered not if it would return, but how much of us it would take. It was not just hunger that haunted the winter. It was the sickness that crept in with it, quiet and unseen. The cold slowed the body, and in that stillness, disease took root. Coughs echoed through the huts like drums of warning. One began, then another, and soon the whole village rasped with breath too shallow, too laboured. Illness moved like wind through our bones, invisible but certain, as present as the frost on our walls. There were no physicians for the likes of us. A wise woman, perhaps, with herbs dried from summer, sage, yarrow, or horehound. But most of her cures were prayers ground into powder. We trusted them because we had nothing else. When someone grew feverish, we wrapped them in wool, gave them broth if we had it, and waited. You learned quickly in winter that waiting was sometimes all you could do, for healing or for death. Children suffered first. Their lungs were not strong, their bodies not ready for months of smoke, mould, and chill. I remember one girl, her breath rattling like grain in a shaken sack, her skin flushed and then paled, her eyes sunken. Her mother placed a coin on her forehead, whispering words she no longer believed. That child did not see spring. She was buried beneath frozen earth that had to be broken with axes, the ground resisting even our grief. We did not know what germs were. We thought illness came from bad air, from the stars, from sin. A cold was a punishment, a fever, a warning. We spoke of miasmas, of foul humours, of spirits lurking in the corners of rooms left too long unblessed. The truth was simpler and sadder. We lived too close, too unwashed, too weak. One man's breath became another's death. And still, we pressed close for warmth, for company, for the illusion of safety. The church bells tolled more often in winter. Their sound carried across the snow like morning wrapped in music. Each chime marked another name, another absence. Funerals were brief. The cold allowed no lingering. Priests said prayers with blue lips, their fingers too numb to turn the pages of scripture. We clutched each other in the silence afterward, the world suddenly wider with one less soul in it. The coughing never stopped. It became a background hum to daily life. We grew used to the sound of phlegm, of breath stolen in pieces. When someone stopped coughing, that's when you worried. Silence meant their lungs had given up. I once sat beside a friend and held his hand through the night. He wheezed, then whimpered, then was gone. The fire still burned. The world had not changed. But something in me had. Boils, rashes, fevers, aches. We knew them all, yet understood none. Disease was a mystery we could not unravel. We only named it when it took hold. The wasting, the choking, the shaking. It had many faces, and none of them were kind. Some sought penance, flagellating themselves to cleanse sin. Others grew bitter, angry at God, at fate, at their own bodies that betrayed them so cruelly. Winter made sickness not just likely, but inevitable. It thrived in the still air of our homes, in the damp straw beneath our beds, in the shared bowls and spoons. And when it came, it did not leave quickly. We did not battle it. We endured it. Because that was what winter demanded of us in all things. Not victory, but endurance. Always endurance. Fetching water in winter was a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. The wells we relied upon often froze solid, lids sealed shut by thick ice that no blade could pierce without great effort. I remember striking the surface again and again, the echo dull and lifeless, the cold biting up through the iron into my hands. When the water gave way, it was like finding treasure, heavy, cold treasure that you had to carry home before it froze again. Snow was our fallback. We scooped it from the ground, from rooftops, from the bare branches of trees. But snow carried more than cold. It carried filth. It picked up soot from thatch, droppings from birds, ash from chimney smoke. Some tried to melt it straight over the fire, and the smell it gave off often betrayed what was hidden inside. Others strained it through cloth, hoping to purify what could not truly be made clean. Boiling water would have helped, but firewood was too precious. You did not waste it on what appeared pure. So we drank, hoping that what looked clear would not carry illness. But often it did. Stomach cramps, vomiting, fevers. They came without warning. I once drank melted snow from a bucket and was doubled over by evening, the pain like hot iron twisting in my gut. That night, I slept beside the hearth with nothing but prayers in my mouth. When water became tainted, we could not always tell. There were no signs, no colours, no warnings. Only time revealed the truth. A mother gave her child a sip, and days later, he would grow silent, his belly bloated and hard. Dysentery spread fast, especially in close quarters. I saw whole households weakened, crawling to the door in search of air, only to collapse in their own filth. And still, we needed to drink. We had no choice. Buckets cracked in the cold. Clay jugs shattered if left too close to the fire, then too near the frost. We carried water in leather pouches, in bark cups, in whatever held shape. Once, I saw a man drink from his cupped hands as the water refroze between his fingers. His lips bled from the chill, but he smiled. He had found something clean, or so he believed. In winter, belief was often the only nourishment stronger than fear. The stream near our village flowed slowly, half choked by ice. Some braved the banks, slipping on stones, breaking limbs just to dip a pail into moving water. It was cleaner there, we thought. The flow meant life. But the walk was long, and not all returned. Wolves tracked those trails too, drawn by the scent of sweat and the promise of struggle. A pail of water could cost you more than strength. It could cost your life. We reused what we could. Wash water became cooking water. Bath water became drinkable again after settling. It was foul but familiar, the smell of shared labour. There was no shame in it, only the silent pact of survival. If someone was caught wasting a drop, even in jest, they faced cold stares. Water was not free, not then. It was earned, carried, suffered for. I still think of that water. Heavy, fragile, vital. More than food, more than fire. It shaped our days and defined our health. In the cold months, it was both our enemy and our salvation. And every sip came with a prayer, even if we no longer spoke it aloud. Let this be clean. Let this keep me here one day more. Washing in winter was not an act of cleanliness, but a punishment. The water stung like needles, and the air froze droplets to the skin before they could be wiped away. I remember trying to rinse my hands in a basin once, only to watch a thin sheet of ice form across it before I could even dip my fingers. We avoided it when we could. Dirt was safer than frostbite. The body would survive filth. The cold was far less forgiving. Soap was scarce, and when it did exist, it was harsh, made from animal fat and lye. It cracked the skin, left rashes, and stripped the little oil that protected us from the wind. Most peasants washed only when absolutely necessary, before certain religious feasts, births, or burials. But those moments were brief and more symbolic than effective. We wiped more than we bathed, a damp cloth to the face perhaps, or a rag across the neck when it stung too much to bear. Our clothes, always wool, were rarely changed. They clung to us for weeks, sometimes months, until the season turned. The fabric grew stiff with sweat, smoke, and grease. Lice nested deep in the seams. Fleas bred in the folds. Some folk would boil their garments over fire to kill the vermin, but that risked shrinking or destroying the only protection they had left. I remember scratching until my skin bled, the welts like angry paths drawn across my arms. The stench was inescapable, a mix of unwashed bodies, mold, damp straw, and sickness. It clung to your hair, your breath, your very thoughts. We became so used to it that we no longer noticed, until someone new arrived, or until the thaw came and stirred it fresh from the floor. It was not shameful, it was simply life. The nose adapted to what it could not change. Toilets, as you know them, did not exist. We used buckets, corners, fields, whatever was available. Waste was buried, if possible, but in the frozen ground, often it simply froze in place. The air inside our huts was sometimes thick with the reek of humanity, but there were worse things than odor. Cold, for one. Hunger. So we ignored the smell. We breathed through it, as we did everything else. The rivers and streams we used in warmer months were too treacherous in winter. I once saw a boy fall through the ice while trying to wash a pot. The current took him. His parents lit candles for days, but his body was never found. That moment taught us a cruel truth. Cleanliness, noble as it was, could kill. Better to live with grime than die in the pursuit of purity. Even bedding was rarely washed. Straw was changed when the scent turned unbearable or lice overwhelmed it. Until then, we slept atop it night after night, letting our warmth seep in and our sweat turn it damp. I still recall the smell of winter straw, musty, earthy, laced with the weight of human presence. We didn't mind it. It meant a bed, however humble. Looking back, hygiene was not a forgotten virtue. It was a luxury we could not afford. In the hierarchy of survival, it sat far below warmth, food, and faith. We cleaned when we could, endured when we couldn't, and so we carried the winter on our skin as well as in our hearts. A season not just of cold, but of accumulated living. Heavy, unwashed, and endured in silence. Fire was more than comfort. It was breath itself. Without it, we froze. With it, we lived a little longer. But firewood was not easy to come by. It had to be cut in the autumn, dried, and stored with care. Those who failed to prepare faced the frost with empty arms. I've known families who spent more time searching for wood than eating meals, wandering the edge of the forest with axes worn thin and hands stiff from the cold. Cutting trees was not the simple task it may seem. Axes dulled quickly. Backs ached. Trees, once felled, had to be hauled, split, and stacked. Most peasants had no carts, no horses, only rope, shoulders, and hope. I remember dragging a log across 1/2 mile of ice-packed ground, my breath clouding the air like smoke. When I reached the hut, my hands bled through the gloves I'd fashioned from rags, but I had wood, and that was enough. We rationed each piece. A log too large was a waste, too small, and it would not catch. Mornings were spent coaxing flame from dying embers, blowing gently, feeding twigs as if they were infants. There was no margin for error. Let the fire die, and your fingers might go with it. I lost the tip of my left pinky that way. The cold took it before I even realized. It turned white, then grey, then gone. When wood ran out, and it often did, we burned whatever we could find. Dried cow dung, straw, thatch pulled from our own roofs, furniture if we had it. I watched my neighbour toss in the last leg of a stool that had belonged to her father. She did not weep. She simply turned away and warmed her hands. Survival stripped objects of their sentiment. Everything became fuel. Gathering wood from the Lord's forest was illegal. The penalty could be a fine, or worse, but many risked it nonetheless. I once went out with a friend at dusk, boots crunching over the crust of snow, hearts pounding with fear, not of wolves, but of men. We found nothing that night, and he was caught the next morning with a bundle of twigs. His punishment was a week without rations. In winter, that was nearly a death sentence. Wet wood smoked, hissed, and refused to burn. But sometimes, that was all we had. The hut filled with choking grey air, our eyes watering, our lungs struggling. Yet we endured it, preferring smoke to silence, the sting to the stillness of cold. I sometimes wonder if we were warmer from the flame or from the belief in its promise. Fire gave us something to do, to tend, to hope for. Children were sent out with baskets looking for anything dry, branches, bark, even fence posts loosened by frost. They came back red-faced, fingers curled in pain, but they came back with something, and that something became a flame. We praised them for their bravery, even as we cursed the world that made such bravery necessary for so little return. Firewood was life measured in splinters. Every stick, every spark, every ember was counted. We did not waste. We did not forget. And in those flames, flickering weakly in the heart of our homes, we saw not just heat, but endurance. A silent defiance against a world that wanted us still and frozen. When the cold pushed us inward, it drove the rats in with us. They scurried through walls, gnawed at sacks of grain, and clawed under doors in the dead of night. I often awoke to the sound of their feet on the beams above, or worse, their teeth rasping softly on wood or bone. We shared our winter not only with family, but with these small, relentless thieves who came not just for food, but for warmth, for blood, for survival. They were bold in those months. Hunger made them fearless, and darkness gave them cover. I once caught one in my boot, curled in the toe like a parasite, trembling from cold but unwilling to flee. Another time, I reached for a loaf and found only crumbs and droppings. The rats had been there first, as they often were. No food was truly yours unless you defended it, hid it, or ate it the moment it was made. Vermin gnawed through the walls, the floors, even flesh. There were stories, true ones, of infants bitten in the night, their tiny fingers chewed while they slept. I remember wrapping the hands of a newborn in thick cloth, not for warmth, but for protection. The rats did not care for innocence. They came for the weak, the quiet, the unguarded, and they always returned. Poison was unknown to us. Traps were crude, and bait was precious. Most of us simply endured. Cats could have helped, but cats were rare in our world. If a village had one, it was revered, fed scraps, kept warm like royalty. We had no such guardian. Dogs chased rats, but only if awake and fed. And often, they were neither. I once tried to train a terrier for the task, but hunger dulled its instincts. It turned on our scraps instead, and the rats danced freely in the corners of our home. The diseases they carried were silent killers. We did not understand the connection, but we saw the results. A healthy man would fall ill after a single bite. A child would wither without visible wound. We called it bad air or cursed luck, not knowing that the fleas these vermin bore were messengers of plague. When people began coughing blood, we prayed. When they died, we buried them quick and hoped the rats would not follow us home. Their eyes glinted red in the firelight. I saw them sometimes, watching from the shadows, bold as sentries. One stared at me for nearly a minute before slinking behind a pile of wood. In that moment, I understood. We were not masters of our homes, merely tenants. Winter belonged to the creatures who could take what they needed without remorse, without rest. And the rats knew no shame. Food stores were hung from beams or buried beneath floors. We tied sacks with rope, nailed lids shut, covered bowls with iron plates. Still, the gnawing found a way, and each morning brought fresh evidence. Teeth marks, droppings, scattered crumbs. It was a war we fought daily, with no victories, only delay. We never defeated them. We merely slowed them down long enough to eat first. I've never forgotten that sound, the skittering of feet across cold wood, the rustle of sacks torn open in the dark. It was winter's chorus, alongside coughing and creaking beams. And when I hear it now, faint as it is in memory, I am returned to that place, that world where even the smallest mouths threatened to consume what little remained. where even the darkness was alive with hunger. Winter did not bring rest. It brought more labor, harder and colder than before. The snow may have softened the roads and buried the fields, but our duties only grew heavier. Animals needed feeding, stalls needed mucking, roofs needed patching against the weight of frost and wind. Each task became a trial, and every movement a slow battle against the biting air. I learned early that to stop was to freeze. Stillness was the enemy. I rose before light and stepped into boots already stiff with frost. The cold hit my lungs like fire. The barn door groaned as I forced it open, revealing cows with ribs like fences and eyes wide from the chill. Their breath misted in the air like smoke. I hauled water in frozen buckets, broke ice with a blunt stick, and prayed each morning that the animals had made it through the night. For if they didn't, our food and future would vanish with them. We mended what we could. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, hinges split from the cold. Climbing a ladder in snow was a gamble. I once slipped and landed on frozen earth, the wind knocked from me. I lay there a long time, staring up at the grey sky, thinking how easy it would be to stay there. But there were mouths to feed and fires to tend. So I stood, though my body protested, and worked until my fingers bled. Chopping wood became a daily ritual. It warmed the body twice, first with the labour, then with the flame. But the axe grew dull, and wood grew scarce. I knew men who split beams from their own homes to stay warm. I watched one weep as he fed the carved leg of a cradle into the fire. His child was gone. The wood, at least, could still give warmth. Grief and duty often met in winter. Fetching water from frozen wells or distant streams was no small task. The path was treacherous, and the buckets heavy. Slip, and you could shatter bone or spill what little you had. One evening, I returned with half a pail, my hands too numb to hold it steady. My mother did not scold me. She simply poured what remained into a pot and gave thanks it was enough to boil. Clothing needed constant attention. Holes appeared like ghosts. Gloves tore. Shoes lost soles. We stitched by firelight, squinting through the smoke. I used to watch my sister sew patches onto her dress with fingers cracked and raw. Each stitch was crooked, but each one mattered. There was no such thing as pride in appearance, only pride in endurance, in making do. Even the children worked. They gathered kindling, swept ash, carried feed. I saw one small boy collapse beneath a bundle of straw, too light to bear its weight. His father picked him up without a word, placed the straw on his own back, and walked on. We had no time for comfort, only continuity. Work passed down like breath from one body to another, and at the end of each day, we did not sigh with relief. We simply stopped until dawn pulled us forward again. In the modern world, winter may be a pause, a time of retreat. But for us, it was the hardest season. One long, relentless task, performed with numb hands and aching bones. And no matter how much we did, it was never enough. But we did it anyway, because we had to. When illness or injury struck, we had only what our hands could do and what the earth had once provided. There were no doctors among us. Physicians belonged to cities, to lords, to those whose coin could summon learning. We, the peasants, relied on the old ways, salves made of fat and herbs, prayers whispered over wounds, and patience laced with fear. Most often, time was the only medicine. And it was as likely to kill as to heal. Break a bone, and you bound it as best you could. Splints were made from sticks, cloth torn from what little we wore. I once saw a man with a shattered leg dragged home by two others. They laid him on straw and wrapped the limb tight, but the bone never set true. He walked crooked for the rest of his life, if one can call it walking. More often, such wounds led to fever, then silence. The body could not afford to break. Burns were common, from the hearth, from boiling water, from the careless knock of a pot in a dark hut. A burn meant days of agony, then weeks of rot. If blisters opened, infection followed. We did not understand what caused it. We only knew the signs: the swelling, the stench, the skin blackening at the edges. I watched a child die from a burn no larger than a coin. His mother wept quietly, wiping his brow with cloth soaked in thyme. Pregnancy and birth were acts of courage. Women gave birth on floors, with other women kneeling beside them, hands firm and hearts steady. There was no midwife in our village, only knowledge passed down like recipes. I've heard screams that could crack wood, and I've seen newborns laid in silence. Some lived, some did not. There was no prediction, only prayer. And when mothers bled too much, we had no way to stop it. They faded before our eyes, their strength leaving like steam from hot bread. Wounds festered quickly. A simple cut from a sickle, a scrape from ice, it was enough. We used garlic poultices, honey if we had it, or the cleanest cloth we could spare. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. When the rot set in, the skin turned red, then purple. Then came the fever, the shaking, the silence. We buried many who seemed fine just days before. Toothaches became unbearable. Without help, we pulled them ourselves, using knives or heated iron. I've seen grown men cry from the pain, not for the tooth, but for the fear of what came after. A single abscess could kill, and it often did. We knew the danger when the jaw swelled, when the fever came, but there was nothing to be done. Only watch, only wait. There was one woman, old and bent, who knew more than most. She spoke to plants, brewed bitter teas, smeared pastes on skin with hands that trembled but never missed their mark. We called her blessed or cursed, depending on the outcome. But even she could only do so much. When the body chose to give in, no herb could stop it. She watched death as often as we did, and I believe it wore her down one soul at a time. We lived with pain, not as a guest, but as a companion. It taught us to be careful, but it never spared us. There were no cures, no promises, only hope, thin, fragile hope, and the quiet bravery of enduring one more day. And when the body failed, we wrapped it in cloth, dug through frozen soil, and laid it to rest beside others who had also fought and lost and gone quietly into the snow. When the sun sank below the horizon, it did not return quickly. Winter nights stretched on like a test of spirit, long, silent, and filled with a darkness that seemed alive. There were no clocks to mark the hours, only the slow crawl of shadows across the floor and the deep ache of sleepless limbs. The fire dimmed quickly. The cold crept closer, and we waited for light, as if salvation would come with dawn. Candles were rare and precious. Most of us could not afford to burn tallow simply for comfort. We used them for prayer, for birth, for death, not for leisure. So the nights were truly dark. I remember staring into the void, my eyes open and useless. Every creak of the wood, every whistle of wind through the roof became a threat. We told ourselves it was nothing. But still, we listened and waited and feared. Superstition filled the silence. Spirits, demons, the souls of the unburied. These were not stories for us. They were explanations for the unexplained. Why did the child cry at midnight? Why did the dog growl into the corner? Why did someone not wake in the morning? In the absence of knowledge, fear took shape, and winter gave fear all the time and space it needed to grow. I slept with a knife beneath my bedding, not for thieves, but for what could not be named. My grandmother used to place iron nails around the doorway to ward off evil, and we never questioned her. We did not laugh at charms or holy water. In a world where death could come without reason, belief was a shield. Not always strong, but better than nothing. Children clung to their parents at night, not from affection, but from fear. Their small voices whispered in the dark, asking if the wind was angry, if the shadows were alive. We had no answers, only the quiet reassurances passed down through generations. It's only the cold, we said, only the wind. But even we didn't fully believe it. We knew the cold could kill, and we had heard voices on the wind that sounded too much like weeping. Even the animals sensed it. The cows shifted uneasily. Chickens refused to roost near open corners. The dog would bark into the dark, tail between its legs. And when the howling came from the hills, wolves or something worse, we held our breath and prayed it would pass. I've known grown men to cry in winter's midnight, not from pain, but from a sorrow they couldn't name. Sometimes I would rise and feed the fire again, more for the sound than the heat. The crackling reminded me I was still here, still alive, still fighting. I would warm my hands and stare into the flames, seeing faces, memories, hopes. The fire became a friend, a light in the void, something to hold on to when the night seemed endless. And when the first hint of dawn finally touched the sky, a faint blue, a sigh on the horizon, we felt it in our chests. Not joy, exactly, but relief. We had made it through another night, and in winter, that was no small thing. It meant the shadows had not won, the cold had not claimed us, and that, for now, we still had time. In winter, death did not come as a surprise. It came as a rhythm. We expected it, prepared for it, spoke of it without ceremony. The old died first, then the sick, then the children. And sometimes the strong followed anyway. I can still recall the mornings when I would walk through the village and see a door left ajar, a sign that someone within had not risen. No one needed to be told. We understood. We did not weep loudly. Tears froze on the face, and grief had no room in a body already tired from hunger and cold. Mourning was a quiet act, a longer pause by the fire, a loaf left untouched, a candle burned low into the night. We wrapped the dead in cloth, whatever we had, and carried them to ground that fought us with every inch. The earth was stone in winter. The spade rang out like a bell of labour and loss. Burials were swift, not because we lacked reverence, but because we had no choice. We could not linger, not in that cold. Prayers were mumbled, bodies lowered quickly, and soil heaped with trembling hands. I buried a neighbour once with only 2 others to help. His family had all perished weeks earlier. We dug in silence, each shovelful a cry we dared not voice aloud. And then we went home and stoked the fire, because we had to. Children died often. Their small bodies could not endure what ours barely survived. A cough that lingered, a fever that rose too fast. That was all it took. I once saw a girl, no older than 5, lie down in her mother's lap and never rise again. Her mother did not scream. She just held her for hours, rocking gently, as if the motion might bring her back. But nothing did. Sometimes you heard of entire families lost, a home gone quiet, smoke no longer rising from the chimney. And someone would go, knock on the door, call out. No answer. Inside, they'd find them, huddled together beneath blankets, frozen as one. The image never leaves you, not because it is shocking, but because it is so familiar, so terribly possible. We did not fear death as much as we feared what it left behind. The gaps at the table, the empty beds, the tools without hands to wield them. A man's death meant his family might not survive. A mother's death meant a child would not. Grief came with practical consequences. Who would milk the cow? Who would fetch the wood? Who would remember the songs when all others fell silent? Sometimes we prepared for our own deaths in small ways. A last piece of bread saved, a blanket folded just so, words whispered to a child, a look held a little longer, not out of despair, but out of realism. Winter was a thief, and we never knew whose door it would knock on next. So we tried to live with our eyes open, our hearts steady, and our souls as clean as the season would allow. And yet, amid so much loss, we endured. We remembered the names, we marked the days, we spoke of the dead with care, not to mourn endlessly, but to keep them among us. For in a world ruled by silence and snow, memory was a kind of light, and those we lost became stars we could see through the cracks in the thatch when all else was dark. In those long winters, there was no safety net to catch you when things fell apart. No store to visit, no money to spend, no neighbour with extra to spare. If your fire died, you were cold. If your food ran out, you were hungry. If you fell ill, you were still expected to work. The world did not stop to offer aid. It simply moved on, indifferent. And so, we learned not to expect rescue. We learned to endure. There were no reserves, no hidden stores, no secret funds. What you had in November was what you lived on until April. I once watched a family ration their last jar of dried peas, 1 spoonful per person per day. And when even that was gone, they drank water with herbs to keep the illusion of fullness. They didn't ask for help. No one did. We all knew. There was nothing left to give. The Lord in his manor had grain, had wood, had warmth, but his stores were not for us. Sometimes he'd grant alms, a loaf here, a sack of oats there, but it was rare and never enough. We relied on his mercy, and mercy was often in short supply. I've seen a man kneel in the snow outside the manor gate for hours, waiting for scraps. He left empty-handed, his pride left behind in the snow. If your roof collapsed, you patched it yourself. If your clothes tore, you stitched them with what little thread you had. I remember using the same piece of twine to bind shoes, mend sacks, and tie bundles of firewood. Every item was used and reused until it disintegrated. There were no replacements, only improvisations. And often, those improvisations failed when you needed them most. Children didn't cry over broken toys. They had none. But they wept when their shoes split open, when the wind cut through holes in their sleeves, when hunger became too heavy to ignore. As parents, we had no answers. No one to turn to, no institution to rely upon, just the tight circle of our own breath, the thin walls of our huts, and the hope that tomorrow would be kinder. The church offered prayer, but little else. The priest spoke of divine tests, of suffering as a path to heaven. We listened with bowed heads, even when our stomachs groaned louder than the bells. Faith gave comfort, yes, but not warmth, not food, not healing. It helped us endure, but it did not replace what was lost. I believed and still do, but belief does not mend torn flesh. When disaster struck, when illness or accident or fire arrived, there was no recovery. Not truly. You absorbed the blow and limped forward, 1 step slower, 1 hand weaker. And if you couldn't, you faded. Quietly, without fanfare. Your absence was noted, then life moved on. Winter did not pause for grief, nor did it grant time to rebuild. It demanded motion, even from the broken. So we lived with no margin for error. No room to stumble. Every log, every crust, every step had meaning. It taught us to be resourceful, yes, but also to be silent in our needs. To ask nothing, expect nothing. And perhaps that is why, even now, I flinch at the word help. Not because I reject it, but because I remember a world where it simply didn't exist. Our animals were not just companions, they were life itself. A single cow meant milk, butter, and warmth. A chicken meant eggs, and when needed, meat. A goat meant all of that, and perhaps more, depending on your skill with rope and patience. To lose one in winter was not an inconvenience. It was disaster. I once saw a man fall to his knees when his last hen froze in the night. He held it like a child and wept, not for the creature, but for what it meant. We brought them into the huts, not out of kindness, but of desperation. The body heat of a cow could raise the temperature in a single-room home by a degree or 2, enough to make the difference between frostbite and sleep. Chickens nested in corners. Goats bleated softly through the dark. their smell, their noise, their presence. We tolerated it all because they gave us something no prayer could, a fighting chance. Illness took them quickly. One infection in a pig could spread to the rest in days. With no medicine, we tried what we could. Warm mash, salt rubs, herbs steeped and poured into their mouths. But it was often too little, too late. And once a body went cold, the decision became cruelly simple. Skin it, salt it, eat it. Grief was for spring. Winter demanded practicality. Predators knew the stakes as well. Foxes prowled near the coop. Wolves circled the village edges. I lost a goat to them once, dragged through a hole in the fence I'd repaired just a week before. In the morning, all that remained was a trail of blood and hoofprints in the snow. I followed it for half a mile, not to retrieve the animal, but to rage at the wild. It never raged back. It never cared. Accidents were just as deadly. A slipped hoof, a broken leg, a trough tipped in the night. Small things, but each held weight. You couldn't simply get another. Animals were not easily bought or found. They were raised, cared for, protected like kin. And when one died, it wasn't just loss. It was a hole in the year's entire plan. A future undone by a single frozen night. Even feeding them was a gamble. Hay had to last through months of snow. Grain was rationed carefully. If a beast ate too much, you resented it. Too little, and it starved. I've seen animals grow gaunt and wild-eyed, pawing at empty troughs as snow drifted in through the barn door. Their hunger mirrored ours, and sometimes we locked eyes, man and creature, both asking the same question: how much longer? Children felt the loss deeply. They named the animals, spoke to them, shared secrets no adult was ever meant to hear. And then, when the time came, they watched those same creatures bleed out for stew. It was a brutal lesson, that love did not always mean rescue, that survival often required the unthinkable. I've never forgotten the sound of a child's cry over a sheep we couldn't afford to keep alive. In winter, the line between man and beast grew thin. We relied on them as they did on us, bound by a cold world that showed no favor to flesh of any kind. To lose one was to lose a part of your own breath. And so we counted them each night, whispered to them in the dark, and prayed not only for our safety, but for theirs. Because without them, we were already halfway gone. In the bleakest days of winter, when hunger hollowed the cheeks and breath rose like smoke in the hut, we turned to God not for comfort, but for explanation. Suffering was not seen as misfortune. It was punishment. Every illness, every lost child, every frozen animal felt like a mark against us. We searched our hearts for sin, and when we found none, we searched harder. For surely we thought such pain could not come without cause. The church taught that hardship refined the soul, that enduring winter's wrath without complaint brought us closer to salvation. But when your fingers cracked from cold, when your belly ached from hunger, when your loved ones faded before your eyes, salvation felt far away. We confessed, not with joy, but with desperation, hoping that, in admitting what we didn't even understand, some unseen mercy might be stirred. The priest, wrapped in fur and seated closer to fire than any of us could dream, preached of grace and endurance. He told us of Christ's suffering, of the saints who starved in the wilderness. We nodded, shivering in the pews, our breath visible even inside the chapel. Faith was not a blanket. It did not warm the body, but it was the only thing we had that felt larger than the cold. Superstitions mixed with doctrine. We lit candles to saints for warmth, not miracles. We crossed ourselves before stepping outside at night, not for protection from men, but from spirits. Some wore charms beneath their clothes, pieces of bone, carved crosses, threads from holy vestments. We whispered prayers while boiling water, while fetching wood, while burying the dead. Religion was not an event. It was stitched into every act of survival. There were those who believed they were cursed. Whole families who never saw spring, year after year. Villagers murmured about sins long past, a theft, a betrayal, a forgotten oath. And while no proof was ever shown, fear clung to those names like frost to a window pane. I once sat beside a man who had lost 3 sons in 3 winters. He spoke of God not with reverence, but with dread, as if fearing that one wrong word might invite another blow. Children learned fear early, not just of the cold or of death, but of divine wrath. I remember one who refused to eat, believing hunger was her punishment for lying. Her mother tried to coax her with warm milk, but she wept, saying she deserved the ache. That was the kind of belief we carried, not always kind, but deeply rooted. It was all we knew. Confession became an act of survival, not for forgiveness alone, but to stay in the good graces of a world we did not control. We confessed things we had not done, just in case. We knelt in frozen chapels, whispering sins into the ears of men who shivered less than we did. And when absolution came, it was not joy we felt, but a small flicker of hope. Perhaps this week would be gentler. Faith in winter was not a balm. It was a mirror. It showed us ourselves, small, cold, mortal, and asked us to keep walking anyway. And so we did, with heads bowed, prayers on cracked lips, and eyes that searched the sky not just for sun, but for a sign that we were seen, that our suffering was not in vain, that someone, somewhere, was listening. The cold did not keep things fresh. That is a lie the modern world tells itself. Our huts were damp, the air still, and without proper ventilation, everything we tried to preserve slowly softened, darkened, and turned. Mold grew like ivy on bread, cheese, and even walls. It was a silent invader, spreading unseen until the first bitter taste or foul scent told us we were already too late. We stored grain in sacks hung high to keep it from rats, but the moisture found it anyway. I once opened a bag of barley and found it green and fuzzed with mold, the smell enough to churn my stomach. We had no dryers, no air circulation, no way to check what happened in the shadows. Even smoked meat, if kept too near the hearth or too far from the heat, grew slick with rot. The walls of our homes wept. The thatch above collected condensation, which dripped steadily onto heads, blankets, and food stores. Wooden beams softened, straw bedding soured. I remember waking with my blanket damp beneath me, not from spilled water, but from the air itself, thick and heavy with the breath of too many bodies in too small a space. The damp did not clean. It decayed. Nothing stayed dry. Cloth absorbed the wetness and refused to release it. Firewood smoked more than it burned. Even our shoes, placed near the fire to warm, would sometimes mold where the leather creased. It was a losing battle, fought every day with rags, scraping knives, and hope. I once scraped mold from a wheel of cheese until only a sliver remained, and even that I ate slowly, uncertain. Food preservation was guesswork. Salt was scarce, and vinegar rarer still. We dried what we could, smoked what we dared, buried some in straw or ash. But if the method failed, and it often did, the loss was devastating. A spoiled sack of onions could mean a week without flavour. A spoiled jar of lard could mean no fat to cook with for the rest of the season. Waste was not an option, and yet, waste happened. The mould crept into the air itself. You could smell it, sweet, sour, a rot that settled into your nose and stayed there. Children grew used to it. I once visited a home so thick with the scent of mildew that I stepped back into the cold just to clear my breath. But to them, it was normal. They no longer noticed. That was the tragedy of winter. It dulled even the senses that should have cried out in warning. Sometimes, we ate what was spoiled. Scraped the green from bread, the bloom from the jam, the slimy skin from fruit. It made us sick, but not always enough to stop. Hunger overpowered revulsion. I watched a boy eat berries laced with mold. He smiled as he chewed, only to vomit hours later. His mother wept, not in anger, but in guilt. She had given him the bowl. Decay was not sudden. It came quietly, like everything in winter. It whispered through the walls, crept under lids, softened the edges of what we tried to keep whole. And there was no escaping it. Not in our food, not in our homes, not in ourselves. We molded too in spirit, worn by days that were wet and long and cold. And still we endured, hoping spring would come before all turned to rot. No one bore winter more quietly or more cruelly than the children. Their bodies, small and tender, lost heat faster than ours. Their clothes, often cast down and threadbare, barely shielded them from the wind. I remember wrapping my youngest sister in an old cloak so large it dragged behind her like a funeral train. She laughed at first, but by nightfall she was coughing. And days later, she was still. Children ate last, if at all. Their bellies swelled not from food but from hunger. Their eyes lost their shine. Their voices grew soft. I once held a boy who hadn't spoken in 3 days. He just watched the fire, mouth slightly open, as if waiting for something to fall into it. That winter, he did not survive, and though we buried him quickly, his absence echoed in the silence he left behind. Play was a luxury they rarely knew in the cold months. A ball of rags, a carved stick, a game of pebbles. These brief joys vanished when snow came. Their feet froze, their fingers cracked, and their laughter turned to whimpers. I saw children rub their hands together so hard their skin peeled. But they smiled when they felt the warmth, even if it lasted only seconds. That's what made it worse. Their hope. When sickness came, it claimed them first. The smallest cough could turn into a storm within a child. Fever flushed their cheeks and robbed their strength with terrifying speed. Mothers held them close, whispering prayers into hair tangled with sweat. I saw a girl die in her father's arms, wrapped in a blanket they had both shared. He didn't move for hours after. Winter teaches a man how to hold still for grief. Education, if it existed, was abandoned in winter. Letters and numbers meant little when survival was the lesson. Instead, they learned to carry wood, to fetch water, to feed the animals. I remember a boy of 7 splitting kindling with a blade too heavy for his hands. He nearly lost a finger. His father laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. There was no time to scold, only to continue. Even sleep was dangerous. Children would huddle together, 3 or 4 beneath one blanket. Some nights, one would wake up cold beside a sibling who had not. I remember one morning, the smallest didn't stir. The others didn't notice at first, not until his hand, stiff and pale, fell from the shared cloth. That scream haunts me still. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost questioning, as if asking the air why. They dreamed of spring more vividly than the rest of us. They spoke of berries, of running barefoot, of days when the sun touched their skin again. We nodded, encouraged the talk, not because we believed it was near, but because we needed them to. If the children stopped hoping, the winter truly had won. And yet, some endured. Frail bodies grew stronger, soft minds hardened into resilience. Those who survived carried winter in their bones for life. I've seen old men tremble in springtime, not from cold, but from memory. They remember the winters of their youth, when childhood was not measured in years, but in how many frostbitten nights they survived. And in their eyes, you still see the child who once waited for the thaw. We did not live alone, but we often suffered as if we did. The huts were small, the bodies many, and the cold gave no space for comfort. We huddled close, shoulder to shoulder, sharing breath, warmth, and exhaustion. Privacy was a dream. Everything was shared. Meals, beds, air, illness. I recall waking one night to a cough so deep I thought the roof had cracked. It was only my uncle, gasping beside me in the dark, sweat freezing on his brow. When food grew scarce, eyes grew sharp. Suspicion took root in corners where laughter once lived. Who was eating more? Who had hidden something? I saw a mother argue with her own sister over a heel of bread. Voices low, tense, filled with quiet accusation. They made peace the next morning, but the wound lingered. Hunger does not just empty the stomach, it hollows the heart. Lice spread with ease. One child scratching became 2, then 5. We passed combs through greasy hair, boiled blankets when we could, cursed the beasts that multiplied faster than kindness. And yet, we stayed close, because distance meant cold, and cold meant death. So we endured the itch, the smell, the noise of others shifting in the night. It was better than silence, barely. Tensions flared. Words once swallowed came out sharp. I watched a man strike his brother over firewood, not because he hated him, but because he was tired and cold and afraid. Apologies came later, often with tears, but the cracks remained. Winter exposed our raw edges. There was nowhere to hide, not even within ourselves. The walls were thin, and so were our tempers. We shared everything, even grief. When someone died, we sat together in silence, the body beside us for hours before burial. There was no room to mourn alone. We wept quietly into sleeves, then returned to chores. It was not unfeeling. It was necessary. The living still needed feeding, warming, carrying. Pain did not excuse you from duty, not in winter. Children fought, as children do, but their bickering felt sharper, more desperate. A stick became a weapon. A stolen crust became cause for tears. We scolded them, but gently. They were only mirrors of our own unrest. I once saw a boy give his only blanket to his sister after such a fight. That moment, silent and unnoticed by most, reminded me of what held us together when everything else pulled us apart. Laughter, though rare, did come, usually late at night, after exhaustion softened our edges. A joke, a story, a memory of warmer days. We clung to these moments. They reminded us that even in a room full of suffering, humanity could still flicker like flame. And where there was flame, there was still life. Communal living was no comfort, not really. But it was a necessity, a fragile alliance against the cold. We leaned on each other not because we wanted to, but because we had to. And in that closeness, messy and flawed as it was, we found something just shy of hope. Something that let us say, quietly and without certainty, we are still here, together, for now. In those days, we had no words for the weight inside our minds. No one spoke of sorrow that stayed too long, or fear that never left. A man who withdrew was called lazy. A woman who wept often was called weak. We didn't know to ask what burden they carried, only to urge them back to work, back to silence, back to the rhythm of survival. The soul was for God to tend, the mind was left to endure alone. Winter deepened these shadows. The endless dark pressed against the spirit like a stone on the chest. I remember sitting by the fire one evening, staring at the same log for hours, my thoughts tangled and numb. I hadn't eaten in a day, but it wasn't hunger that dulled me. It was something deeper, a hollowing from within, quiet and slow, like snow covering a road you used to walk. Children grew sullen. They stopped playing, stopped asking questions. They stared at nothing or cried without reason. We called it the winter silence, as if naming it made it less strange. But I see now it was despair, creeping into hearts too young to bear it. And still, we scolded them for laziness. Urged them to fetch wood, to feed the hens. Anything but sit and feel. Some laughed too much, wild, strange laughter that unsettled the room. Others stopped speaking altogether. There were days when someone simply lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unresponsive to word or touch. We let them be, thinking it a passing mood, but for some, it never passed. They became shadows in the home, present but unreachable, and there was no help to offer, only more cold, more waiting. Faith, for many, was the only medicine. The priest would tell us to pray, to confess, to trust in God's plan. And we did. But prayer does not fill the belly. It does not light the morning sky. It cannot always hush the voices that echo inside a restless mind. I've seen men kneel for hours in frozen chapels, not for redemption, but to stop themselves from screaming. We did not understand the toll winter took on the spirit. We saw its marks on the body, frostbite, starvation, fever, but not on the soul. We did not see how the lack of sun, the monotony, the helplessness chipped away at a person, how it made them forget who they were before the snow came, how it left them quiet, withdrawn, or angry without cause. I once watched a woman sit by the fire with her dead child in her lap for nearly a day. She rocked slowly, humming a song none of us knew. We let her, not because we understood, but because we didn't. What could we say? What comfort was there? We had no healing words, no counselors or understanding, only time. And even that could not always mend. We survived, yes, but not always whole. Many of us carried winter within long after the snow melted. It lingered in the way we paused at doorways, in how we flinched at silence, in dreams that woke us in the night. We bore the weight of unseen wounds, and because we had no names for them, we called it strength. But now, I wonder how many simply endured, when they might have been saved by being understood. Winter has a sound, or rather, the absence of one. It's a hush that settles over everything, thick as wool, swallowing even the cry of a raven or the creak of a branch. In the deepest nights it was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, and sometimes I feared it would be the last sound I'd ever know. That kind of silence doesn't comfort. It watches you. It waits. The snow muffled all movement. Footsteps vanished. Voices didn't carry. The wind, when it came, howled. But when it didn't, the world held its breath. Inside the hut, we spoke in whispers, not out of reverence, but because loudness felt wrong. Even children, usually so full of noise, fell into the rhythm of hush. Their laughter faded. Their games quieted. Everything became slow, still, strained. I remember one night sitting with my family, 7 of us in a single room, and no one said a word for hours. The fire crackled. Someone coughed, but no stories were told, no songs were sung. It was as though the cold had pressed its hand over our mouths. When finally someone did speak, a comment about the weather, the sound was jarring, almost frightening. Isolation worsened it. If the snow was deep or the paths frozen, we went days, even weeks, without seeing neighbours. The village grew smaller, the world narrower. You could forget that others existed beyond your own walls. I often wondered if other families still lived, still breathed, or if we were the last ones left. That fear crept in slowly, like frost at the edges of a window. The silence did things to the mind. You began to imagine footsteps outside, whispers in the corner, a breath not your own. I once woke in the night certain someone had spoken my name, but no one had. My family slept beside me, motionless. I lay awake the rest of that night, not in fear of a spirit, but of the emptiness that had shaped my thoughts into ghosts. Even the animals quieted. Chickens clucked less. Cows stood still, their lowing rare. The only sound I often heard was the endless drip of melting snow off the roof, rhythmic and slow, like a clock counting down, though I didn't know to what. In those moments, the silence didn't soothe. It accused. It reminded you how small you were, how alone. There were some who couldn't bear it. A man in our village once walked out into the snow, barefoot and silent. They found him days later, curled beneath a tree, his body frozen, his eyes wide open. No one knew why he'd gone, but some of us understood, not in words, but in the quiet that followed his death. A kind of knowing silence, a respectful one. And yet, we stayed, we listened, we endured. Because in that silence, unbearable as it was, we sometimes heard something else. The soft crackle of life still burning, the sigh of a child shifting in sleep, the whisper of hope not yet extinguished. And that, perhaps, was enough to carry us through another day, another night, another silence. Of all the ways winter claimed its own, freezing in your sleep was the quietest. There was no warning, no cry, no struggle, only stillness. A man would lay down beside the fire, wrapped in what rags he had, and when morning came, he did not rise. His breath had stopped somewhere in the darkness, carried off without ceremony. I have seen it. I have touched the cold hand of a friend who'd been warm only hours before. We feared this most on the coldest nights, when the air inside felt sharper than ice and the fire could no longer push back the dark. Sleep, usually a comfort, became a risk. I remember sitting upright for hours, nodding off only to jolt awake at the thought I might not wake again. Some tied bells to their wrists, hoping movement would wake them. Others forced themselves to walk the room, stamping their feet, whispering psalms to stay alert. Children were especially vulnerable. They lacked the weight, the body heat, the awareness to guard themselves. Parents would wake in the night to touch their cheeks, press their fingers to tiny chests, listening for breath. I recall a woman who kept her newborn beneath her shawl, next to her heart, night after night. One morning, the baby was still, not cold, just still, as if winter had stolen him without leaving a trace. Old folk went quietly. Some even welcomed it, I think. After so many years of struggle, the thought of slipping away in the warm hush of dreams was not so cruel. One elder I knew smiled before bed and said, "If I do not wake, let spring take me gently." He passed that night. We buried him in the frost and spoke his name softly, like a breath. That was how he lived. That was how he left. Fires were tended with desperation. One ember could mean the difference between waking and never again. I remember crouching over the hearth at midnight, blowing gently, coaxing life back into a bed of ash. My fingers numb, my lips cracked, but the spark returned, and with it, hope. We did not rest easily. We rested out of necessity, always one eye half open, always a hand near the flame. We took turns keeping watch, especially when someone was sick. The week could drift away in an hour. You could be speaking to them at dusk, and by dawn, find their skin waxen, their body stiff. I sat with my brother one such night. He had a fever. I fed the fire and held his hand. He lived. But not all did. Many died with someone beside them. And still, the cold won. There were no signs, no warnings, just silence. A person might sigh, shift, and then nothing. We learned to touch, to check, to listen. I can still feel the dread of those moments, reaching for a shoulder, calling a name, waiting for the smallest stir. And when it didn't come, there was no panic, only a quiet acceptance. Another soul gone, another bed empty, another winter deeper. To freeze in sleep was feared, but also perhaps understood. It was gentler than hunger, quieter than disease. The cold did not torment, it simply invited. And for many, after weeks of pain and darkness, it seemed a soft way to go. But for those left behind, it was one more reminder that even sleep, in winter, was not safe. Not even dreams could be trusted to carry us through. There was no running from the cold, no journey south, no village on the other side of the hill where warmth waited. Winter blanketed everything. Our world shrank to the hut, the barn, the nearby path to the well, and even those became perilous. I remember standing outside once, staring at the horizon, imagining a place where the wind didn't burn the skin and the sky wasn't always grey. But imagining was all I could do. Travel was impossible. Roads turned to ice or vanished beneath snowdrifts. Carts froze in place, their wheels locked. Horses grew weak from hunger, their ribs sharp beneath thinning coats. If you set out, you did so with risk. I've known men who left in search of food and never returned, swallowed by snow, lost in woods where even the trees seemed asleep. Their families waited for weeks before admitting what they already knew. The forest, wide and wild, offered no relief. It may have whispered of escape, but it held dangers of its own. Wolves, cold, darkness. They made sure no one wandered far. I once went out searching for firewood and lost my bearings in a storm. The snow fell so thick I could see only white. My breath froze in my beard and I panicked, circling for what felt like hours before I recognized the bent tree near our fence. I never strayed again. Our villages were like islands, each isolated by the same ocean of frost. No messages passed, no news arrived. What happened beyond our own walls might as well have been happening on the moon. And so we stayed, not because we were content, but because we had no choice. There were no borders to cross, no passage to buy, no safer ground ahead. The winter was everywhere. Even within the hut, there was no escape. The air was heavy with breath, with sickness, with silence. Walls closed in. Straw beds grew damp. The same faces, day after day, week after week, became both comfort and burden. I loved my family, but in those endless months, I longed for solitude and also feared it. The mind wanders dangerously when trapped in a box of snow. The church bells sometimes rang, but their sound was swallowed quickly. I used to climb the hill to see the horizon, as if the mere sight of distance might offer relief. But it didn't. Just more white, more sky, more wind. There was no beyond, only more of the same. We were prisoners without chains, held fast by cold and circumstance. Some dreamed of spring, of travel, of change, of life beyond the village path. But we did not speak those dreams aloud. It felt cruel, as if tempting a season that already ruled us harshly. We focused on what was before us, the fire, the next meal, the next hour. That was all. That was enough. You could not escape. Not truly. Not by foot, not by thought. Winter surrounded, consumed, held tight. And we learned to stay still, to wait. Not for freedom, but for a thaw. For the world to widen again, if it chose to. Until then, we survived within the narrow bounds of frost, hoping the wind might one day lose interest in our little lives. The cold did not just gnaw at flesh. It weakened the very things we depended on. Tools, once strong and steady, cracked under strain. Iron turned brittle. Wood split from frost. I remember striking an axe against a log and watching the head snap clean from the handle. It wasn't old, only tired, like we all were. In winter, even the strongest things grew fragile. Shoes were worse. Made from leather, stiffened by mud and age, they cracked at the seams and let in the cold. I've walked barefoot over snow because my soles had worn through. The numbness crept up slowly. First toes, then ankles. We stuffed straw inside when we could, or wrapped our feet in cloth. It never truly helped, but it made us feel less helpless, and sometimes that was enough. A broken tool was not a setback, it was a threat. No replacement waited in a chest or a shop. You mended what you could, improvised when you couldn't. I once saw a woman stir soup with a stick after her spoon split in two. Another man carved a shovel handle from an old bedpost. It bent with every use, but it worked. That was our only measure of success. Not beauty, not comfort, but function. Every crack brought dread. A snapped rope, a torn glove, a collapsed basket. Each small failure echoed loudly in the silence of need. There were no spares, no backups. If something broke, it meant another task was now twice as hard, or left undone. And in winter, undone tasks became danger. A bucket that leaked meant fewer trips for water. A torn cloak meant less sleep, more sickness. Shoes often had to last more than a year. Children inherited them, even when the fit was wrong. I recall my sister wearing a pair so tight her toes bled, but she never said a word. We couldn't afford replacements, and complaints changed nothing. We patched them with anything: twine, bark, strips of old cloth. I once used wax from a candle to seal a seam. It held for a day. Tool handles, worn smooth from use, became slippery in frozen hands. I saw a scythe fly from a man's grip once, land in the snow, and vanish like a blade into water. We dug for it, but never found it. The snow had swallowed it whole. He cursed not from fear or anger, but from the knowledge that it could not be replaced. His crop, come spring, would suffer, and so would his family. We stored our best tools indoors near the fire, hoping the warmth would preserve them. But even then, the changes in temperature made the metal swell and contract. Things warped, shifted, failed. I've heard the snap of a cracked handle in the middle of the night, like a tree breaking, a reminder that nothing lasts forever, not in winter. So we held things gently, treated each nail, each sole, each thread with reverence. They were not possessions. They were extensions of our survival. And when they broke, we did not curse loudly. We sighed, picked up the pieces, and began again with whatever we had left, because winter does not care what breaks, only whether you continue anyway. We did not know why sickness struck when it did. There were no theories of bacteria, no talk of vitamins or clean water. Illness was mystery, and weakness was often seen as sin. If someone wasted away, we blamed bad air, or spoiled food, or divine punishment. We did not look to the invisible. We looked to the stars, the season, or our own conscience. Knowledge, in this way, was as cold and distant as the wind that shook our walls. We ate what we had, not what we needed. The idea of nutrition would have seemed strange. Food was survival, not science. A meal was judged by whether it filled the belly, not by whether it strengthened the body. I remember entire weeks where we ate nothing but stale rye bread and boiled roots. The taste grew sour in our mouths, but we chewed and swallowed and thanked God we had anything at all. Some old women spoke of strengthening foods, but these were ideas passed through generations, not learned in books. Garlic for blood, nettles for weakness, lard for cold bones. Sometimes it helped, often it didn't. But we believed, because belief was all we had. And even when it failed us, we returned to it, like a prayer whispered into wind that never answered. We did not connect the dots between filth and fever. A child might drink from a muddy puddle, fall ill, and no one questioned why. We blamed the weather, or fate, or the devil. We washed rarely, and when we did, we thought only of dirt, not the unseen. I once saw a man cut his hand on rusted iron, then bind it with a rag used for milking goats. Days later, his arm turned black. We did not understand. We only buried him. There was no sense of balance in the diet, no thought of what the body lacked or needed. We didn't know about iron, or scurvy, or hydration. We simply endured the effects, without names. Teeth loosened, joints ached, eyes dimmed. We thought it was age, or winter, or God. I've seen a girl cry from bleeding gums, and her mother told her to pray harder. It was not cruelty, it was ignorance. Children grew with bowed legs and sunken eyes. We thought it normal. They were quiet, tired, slow. We praised them for not complaining. And when they died, we said they were too gentle for this world. But I wonder now if they were just starved of what their bodies needed. Not food alone, but something deeper, something we couldn't see and didn't know to give. Even rest was misunderstood. If someone slept too long, we scolded them. Sloth, we said, a deadly sin. But often, it was just the body trying to heal. From cold, from hunger, from quiet disease. We pushed them back to work, thinking labor was the cure. And when they collapsed, we wept in confusion. We were not fools. We were simply unaware. The knowledge that might have saved us had not yet reached our doors. So we did our best with what we had. Herbs, hope, and hard bread. And through some miracle, many of us survived. But we carried within us the consequences of what we did not know. And those consequences, like the cold, stayed with us long after the snow had melted. In the coldest months, when the snow covered all paths and silence ruled the woods, the wolves came closer. Hunger made them bold. Desperation made them linger. We heard them first. Low howls rolling across the fields like a warning, answered by others farther off, echoing from the forest edge. At night, they circled the village unseen, their yellow eyes flickering like coals beyond the reach of our fires. They were not fairy tales to us. They were not symbols or stories. They were flesh and teeth and speed. I once saw one, broad-shouldered and grey, standing at the edge of the trees. It did not run. It stared, unafraid, until I raised my voice. And even then, it backed away, slow, with the confidence of something that knew it would return. And it did. Children were warned never to wander. We kept them indoors, or watched them closely when they fetched water or kindling. Still, some vanished. A boy, not yet 5, slipped out to find his dog. We found his scarf in the snow, torn and red. Nothing more. The forest gave no answers, only more quiet, and a deeper fear. Livestock were easier prey. The wolves tore into coops, dragged goats from pens, ripped through fences we thought strong. I once woke to screaming, not human, but animal. Our last pig, gone before dawn, only blood in the snow, and hoofprints that ended too suddenly. We mourned the loss like a death in the family. In truth, it was one. That pig had meant weeks of meals, warmth, survival. We tried what we could, torches, banging pots, setting watch. Some hung charms on doorways, crosses made of ash, blades above thresholds. But the wolves were not spirits to be warded. They were hunger in motion, and they were not the only danger. Wild dogs, driven from farms or born feral, travelled in packs and fought like devils. A man alone stood little chance against them. Bears were rarer, but they came too, groggy and furious from half-sleep, tearing through stores in a frenzy. One destroyed a neighbour's root cellar in an hour. Potatoes, grain, salted fish, gone. We found the prints the next day, deep and wide, as if the earth itself had been pressed down. After that, we doubled the barriers, not to stop them, but to slow them. But the wolves, they were the true terror. Not because of what they did, but because of what they knew. They watched. They waited. They understood our routines. They came closer in silence, in darkness, in snow that masked their paws. And they did not need to kill often. The fear alone weakened us. The fear made us hesitate. And in winter, hesitation could be fatal. So we told stories, not to scare the children, but to keep them alive. We whispered of eyes in the woods, of shadows that moved, of creatures that followed without sound. And when the fire burned low, we listened, not for footsteps, but for the sound of the world holding its breath. Because when the wolves came, they brought more than teeth. They brought the reminder that nature, like winter, never forgot the hunger we shared. In a peasant's hut, There was no such thing as privacy. We lived together, close and constant, sharing one space for eating, sleeping, working, and dying. Every breath was heard. Every movement was noticed. I recall waking in the night to my brother's sighs as he turned beside me, our backs touching, sharing the last thread of warmth. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. That was life, side by side, always. Bodily functions were not hidden, only hushed. A bucket in the corner, a walk to the frozen ditch outside, that was the extent of it. We looked away when needed, not to grant dignity, but to pretend it still existed. Children learned early to avert their eyes, to offer silence instead of shame. A man relieving himself beside a wall was not indecent. He was just human and cold. When someone fell ill, they remained in the same room, moaning, coughing, fading, as others worked, ate, and tried to sleep. There was no sick room, no curtain, no solitude for suffering. I remember feeding a dying elder beside the fire, while children played at my feet. He was too weak to speak, and they were too young to understand. Still, we lived together, all of us, within inches of one another. The bed, if there was one, was shared. Parents, children, grandparents, all under the same blanket. The closeness was warmth, but also burden. A sleepless child kept the household awake. A shivering elder made us all press tighter. There were nights when I longed for even a few inches of space to stretch, to breathe, without another body pressed against mine. But that space did not exist. Intimacy was quiet, hidden as best it could be. A stolen moment, a turned back, a hand held beneath the blanket. Married couples did not have bedrooms. They had corners, and even those corners were not always theirs. I once watched my parents speak with their eyes more than their mouths, their faces lined with fatigue and tenderness. Love in those winters was not grand, it was patient. Death, too, gave no space. When someone passed, their body remained with us until the earth could be opened. We ate beside them, slept nearby, prayed quietly as the smell grew faint, then stronger. I've seen a body laid on a board by the door, covered in cloth, while children stepped over it on their way to fetch water. Not from disrespect, but from routine. This was how it was done. There was no mirror in our home, no place to look and see yourself alone. Our reflections lived in others, in the way they looked at us, or didn't, in the way they handed us a bowl, or wrapped our feet in cloth when we slept. Dignity was not a right. It was a memory we tried to preserve in our gestures, our silence, our care. We did not complain. To ask for space was selfish. To want solitude was indulgent. So we stayed close, not out of love always, but out of need. And in that closeness, something stronger than comfort sometimes emerged. The quiet strength of presence, of being seen, fully and without pretense. And perhaps, even without privacy, there was still a kind of dignity in that. A dignity that winter could not steal. The hardships we faced were not new. They had roots deeper than any tree in our village, passed down like old tools, worn clothes and half-remembered prayers. My father spoke of winters colder than ours, and his father of times even harder still. Each generation bore the same burdens, hunger, cold, sickness, and carried them forward, not as curses, but as truths of life. We didn't question why. We accepted, endured, and continued the pattern. I remember my grandmother's hands, bent, cracked, always in motion. She had survived famines, plagues, the deaths of children. When I once cried over frostbitten toes, she said softly, "Your mother cried over hers too." It wasn't comfort. It was continuity. We were not alone in our pain, but part of a long, silent line. Our wounds were echoes of those who had come before. Traditions were shaped by hardship. We salted meat a certain way because someone once died from spoilage. We layered straw beneath us because someone long ago learned the earth drew warmth from the bones. These were not lessons in books. They were imprinted in blood and memory. Survival taught them to us, and we passed them along with the same seriousness as scripture. Even our lullabies carried sorrow. Songs meant to soothe spoke of snow, of silence, of sleep that might not end. Children learned early that life was not soft. That winter took what it wished. And so they learned not only to endure, but to expect. I once heard a boy, no older than 6, say, "If I die this winter, bury me with my dog." He said it plainly, as if planning a chore. There was pride too in this inheritance, not in suffering itself, but in surviving it. We told stories not just to remember the pain, but to honor the strength it forged. I knew a man who had lost 3 fingers to frost as a boy. He showed the stump like a medal. "Still chopped wood with the other hand," he'd say. We admired those stories. They made the suffering mean something, but not all endured the same. Some broke beneath the weight they were handed, and we rarely spoke of them. A mother who stopped rising from her bed. A brother who wandered into the snow and did not return. We mourned, but we also moved on. The chain of survival did not allow room for long grief. The fire still needed tending. The roof still needed patching. There was a kind of guilt in surviving, especially when others did not. I have carried that weight, the question of why I lived while others, perhaps gentler or wiser, did not. It is a quiet burden, one that walks beside you through every spring thaw, reminding you that your life was built on the strength and sometimes the loss of those who came before. So we taught our children what we had been taught, not just how to build and cook and mend, but how to endure. We handed down not only knowledge, but memory. And in doing so, we gave them more than tools. We gave them identity. A lineage of survival etched into the frost, carved into the wood of every doorframe, and spoken through lips that had known both hunger and hope. In the world we knew, complaint was a foreign tongue. There was no room for it, no reward in it, and little patience for those who tried. Misery was understood, but not spoken. If you hurt, you endured. If you feared, you prayed. I once watched a boy grit his teeth as his hands swelled from frostbite. He did not cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because he knew there was nothing crying could do. That was the lesson we all learned young. To complain was to admit weakness, and weakness, in the deep of winter, was dangerous. It made others nervous. It made you a liability. I remember feeling hunger so sharp, it blurred my sight. But I said nothing. I worked. I nodded. I smiled when spoken to. Everyone else was hungry too. What made my pain any more worthy of attention? We suffered side by side, and we did so in silence. Even within families, silence was the rule. Parents rarely asked how you felt. They watched. They measured your steps, your breath, your eyes. And if they sensed something wrong, they didn't ask. They handed you more work. Not out of cruelty, but to distract you, to keep you moving. Stillness was when fear crept in. And so we worked. A man digging was a man surviving. If someone did speak their pain, it was met with a quiet stare or a shrug. I once heard an elder say, "Everyone's cold. Be glad you still feel it." That was the closest thing to comfort we were allowed. Expressions of suffering had to be veiled in humor or wrapped in story. A complaint told as a joke might earn a laugh. Told as truth, it earned only discomfort. Shame clung to those who broke. If someone collapsed in tears or fell to anger, others turned away. We did not mock, we simply didn't know what to do. Emotion was not part of the winter script. Endurance was. To express pain was to disturb the fragile balance we all clung to. I once saw a woman leave the hut to cry in the snow, alone. When she returned, we didn't speak of it. We simply made room for her near the fire. Relief came not through words, but through shared effort. A neighbor helping patch a roof, or slipping a crust of bread into a child's hand. These acts spoke louder than lament. They said, "I see your struggle, though I won't name it. I feel it too, though I won't say it." In this way, we comforted one another, not with speech, but with presence. The church allowed a small space for sorrow. Confession was where the soul could speak what the mouth could not say elsewhere. But even there, most spoke only of sins, not of sadness, not of despair. There was no word for depression. No understanding that sometimes the body endures while the heart cannot. We pushed forward, blind to the weight we each carried. So we learned to hide our pain as skillfully as we patched our clothes, not because we were strong, but because the world gave us no other choice. Winter did not listen to complaint. It did not care for tears. It simply watched and waited. And if you stopped, even for a moment, it would remind you why silence was safer. Why in the end, you endured not with your voice, but with your silence. When everything else failed, when the food was gone, the firewood wet, and the cold had crept beneath our skin, we turned to prayer. Not always with words, and not always in the chapel. Sometimes it was just the quiet plea breathed into cupped hands, or the silent look toward the sky through a hole in the roof. We prayed not for miracles, but for mercy. A little less wind, a little more strength. One more day. Prayer wasn't always spoken aloud. It lived in the rhythm of our chores, in the stillness before sleep. I often prayed while carrying water, the pail digging into my palms. Just a whispered line. "Lord, hold me." Not because I thought he'd answer in thunder or light, but because I needed to believe he saw me. That someone, somewhere, was counting the days with me. The chapel, when we could reach it, was our place of gathering, not for celebration, but for collective pleading. The priest, wrapped in wool and wool again, stood at the altar with a voice softened by frostbite. He told us God was watching, that suffering refined the soul. We believed him because belief was warmer than despair. And sometimes, when he spoke, the walls seemed to hold more than just our bodies. They held our sorrow gently. Children mimicked our prayers. They folded hands without knowing why. I remember a small boy kneeling beside the hearth, praying for a lost goat. He prayed with more sincerity than I'd ever seen in a grown man. And when the goat never returned, he didn't cry. He prayed harder. That was the kind of faith we had. Not the kind that guaranteed answers, but the kind that kept the heart from freezing. Prayer was also protest, though we didn't name it that. When we asked for warmth, for food, for healing, we were telling the world that we believed better things could still exist, that even in darkness, light might come. I've seen a dying woman whisper prayers into her last breath, not for herself, but for her daughter to survive the cold. That kind of love, that kind of faith, still humbles me. There were moments of doubt too, when the cold wouldn't break, when another child was buried, when even the animals fell silent. We asked why. We asked if God had turned his face. Some cursed beneath their breath, but even then, they returned to prayer. As if, even in anger, they needed to be heard. Winter didn't punish doubt, it bred it. And in our doubt, we prayed all the more. Prayer was not a cure. It didn't thaw the walls or fill the pot, but it kept the soul moving, like a fire flickering low but not out. It reminded us that we were more than bodies in straw, that beyond the hunger and the frost, there was still meaning. That suffering was not the end of the story, even if we never saw the next chapter. And so we prayed, with cracked lips, with hoarse voices, with hands that ached from work. We prayed because it was all we had left, and because in that fragile offering we found the one thing winter could never fully take, the will to hope. Despite it all, the cold that burned, the hunger that hollowed, the silence that pressed like stone, they lived. Not all, but enough. And that was the miracle. Each winter took its toll, yet come spring, life stirred again. Smoke curled from chimneys. Babies cried in new light, and the fields, once white with death, softened into green. The peasants did not conquer winter, they endured it. And in that, there was a kind of quiet triumph. I remember watching my mother break a frozen crust of bread and share it with 6 hands. She smiled as she did it, as if the act itself was a feast. That smile, thin, tired, but real, is what I think of when I think of survival. It was not just the body that carried on, but the spirit, stubborn and unbroken. We did not sing often in winter, but we hummed. We did not laugh much, but we told stories, even if only to ourselves. Community mattered, even when tempers flared, when resources ran dry, when death visited too often. We leaned on each other. A neighbor mending your fence without being asked. A stranger slipping a carrot into your hand without a word. These moments, small and passing, were lifelines. We stitched our lives together from scraps of kindness and threads of shared suffering. Spring did not erase the memory of winter, but it made it bearable. The thaw came slowly, painfully, dripping from rooftops, softening the earth like a long-held breath. And with it came the planting, the rebuilding, the new births. We did not forget who we had lost, but we honored them by planting seeds, patching roofs, teaching the young how to survive what they would one day face. Some bore the scars in their bodies, a missing toe, a blind eye, a limp from frostbitten flesh. Others bore them in silence, the way their hands never stopped shaking, or how they stared too long at the fire. But even they returned to the fields. They cooked. They sang. They loved. Survival was not just about staying alive. It was about choosing to keep living, fully, even after the cold had taken so much. And so, through faith, through grit, through a will that defied every frozen breath, they made it. Season after season, not as heroes, not as warriors, but as people who simply refused to stop. The world offered them little, but they gave much to one another. And somehow, that was enough. More than enough. I look back now, not with bitterness, but with awe, at those who came before me, at what they endured, at how they passed their strength like fire from one hand to the next. They did not see themselves as strong. They did not name their resilience, but they lived. And in that living, they left us more than stories. They left us proof that even in the harshest dark, the human heart can hold its flame. So as you rest by this fire, traveler, remember them. And if the wind ever finds your door and hardship presses close, remember that once, long ago, people like you faced it too. And though they shivered, starved, wept, and buried their dead, they survived. And now, through memory, through voice, through you, they live again.